Good afternoon and welcome. We got planning news for you. Thank you all very much for joining us once again. We are delighted to welcome as our guest this evening Dr. Sue Young, the Land Use Planning Lead at the Wildlife Trusts. And before I introduce Sue, can I encourage you, as always, to consider making a charity donation in lieu of registration fee. We support charities, Save Me Trust, Brian May's charity, for nature recovery, very apt this week, Shelter to combat the housing crisis, and any of the Ukraine charities, or indeed a charity of your choice. So without further ado, Sue, welcome. And can I ask you my usual questions? Tell us where you're calling from, what theme you've chosen for us this week, and what, if anything, you're drinking. Not that I encourage that, I hasten to add.
I'm calling from just outside Brighton. I am drinking water because it is a very hot and sunny day here, and I've got the windows closed because the seagulls outside are making far too much noise to join in with this podcast. And my theme today is 30 Days Wild, which is something that the Wildlife Trust do every June. We encourage people to connect with nature in some way every day throughout June, take a picture of themselves doing it. So my connection with nature today, for example, is probably listening to the seagulls, but just some small thing that people can do, families can do, schools can do. And it's all about enjoying nature and feeling its value.
Fantastic, Sue. Well, we'll encourage everybody to consider to do that. Hot off the back of No Mo May, which is a great public success last month. Given that you're in Brighton drinking water, I must ask the mother of all ecology in-jokes, which is I hope that water hasn't come from the Hardham extraction point. Anyway, I'll get my coat. I'm here all week. Mary, how are you? You got it. Somebody will get that joke. And you got it.
Oh my goodness me. I'm very well. I'm in the office and I want to just show you our attempt at making the office a little bit greener. So hello, Mary Cook from Town Legal. I'm in the city. So far today, I have walked along to my local tube station, which involves walking along Clapham Common. So that's been my touch of nature. I can't say going to Trafalgar Square, which I did this morning on my way to a meeting, involves much nature because it's quite urban around that part of the world. But I'm very well. Welcome to the show, Sue, and I'm drinking good old London tap.
Thanks, Mary. Great to see you. Sasha, how are you?
I'm very well, Charlie. I'm in London as well. I think quite a few of us are in London because there's a certain planning bar event this evening. But I'm in London and it's lovely to see Sue. Good evening.
Cheers, Sash. Chris?
Yeah, so I'm in London too. We're all going to the Peeper dinner afterwards. And that's why Paul isn't with us, is it? Because he's involved in a seminar with the planning inspectorate. So, I'm in an inquiry in Bromley. I tell you what, this is not a time of the year to be a man, is it? You sit in rooms doing an inquiry with no air conditioning, and I'm in my suit, and I just wish I could wear shorts. I am absolutely baking, and it's horrible, if I'm honest. But I've been looking around Bromley, and you asked us to do the 30 days thing, so I don't know if Rob's got the picture. I discovered this at my little wandering around Bromley yesterday whilst looking at the site. Bromley has decided not to cut its verges, but to do this for the butterflies, invertebrates and bees. And that's all over Bromley. And it's part of the changes that we're making for nature, isn't it?
Good to see you. So, Charlie Banner here. I too am in London. I too am going to the Planning Environment Bar Association dinner tonight, which I'm looking forward to. And I'm going to do a lap it's in Lincoln's Inn. And so I'm going to do a lap of the Lincoln's Inn quad before I go in and look out for nature. And that will be my contribution to 30 Days Wild this evening. I am drinking Diet Coke this evening. So I am water neutral for tonight. Anyway, I'll stop that. Enough. And so before we get on to our interview with you, Sue, we're going to do our case reports. Paul's going to do his by pre-recorded video. As I say to all our guests, please do chip in if there's anything of interest to you, but no obligation at all. And we're going to start with Sasha, and you're going to tell us, Sasha, about an appeal from East Didsbury. So over to you.
Yes, and I think we're on episode about 81, 82, something like that. And I usually get one of you complaining about the script. I'm going to complain about the script because I've given myself a bit of a dud, frankly, self-inflicted pay. And I've been saying quietly, not said a word, as actually Mary's too polite, but you, Chris and Charlie certainly complain if they get a dud. But no, I've only got a dud because I suddenly realised that the inquiry, I'm going to take you to Manchester. And before anyone accuses me of southern bias, it's not a dud because of reasons of geography. It's a bit of a dud because on closer inspection, the LPA threw their hand in. Manchester City Council decided not to oppose the mighty President Supremo of PIBA, Mr. Paul Tucker, and did not oppose the grant of consent. So it was left to the denizens of effectively Didsbury to come and object to this proposal, and they did so. Never a great battleground on highway safety and highway capacity. But of course, the councillors who are all-knowing about such matters took it upon themselves to seek to oppose the application for 75 new homes on the basis that the scheme would be unacceptable. Now, those of you who know their East Didsbury will know that the Fars Wood Lane site is currently, as I understand it, a car park. So doesn't particularly help with a highway safety, highway capacity issue when you've got an existing baseline of quite significant movements generated by a car park. And the proposals we can see was for residential development. Simply put, unfortunately, the local residents did not satisfy the inspector that their objection merited a refusal. And it's something that's creeping into decision letters, and I certainly don't criticise it, but isn't expressions of sympathy. And we've seen that quite a bit, that inspectors say, I appreciate that this judgment to effectively grant consent would be a disappointment to those people who spoke passionately in opposition to the proposals. However, in coming to my decision, I fully considered their concerns. However, the development would accord with the development plan and should effectively be granted consent. So Paul, very well done. He got consent for that proposal, and it shows, frankly, which we all know, that those who seek to fight on in the absence of an LPA case, it's an extremely difficult challenge to effectively persuade an inspector to refuse a consent when the LPA have since the refusal taken the view they no longer object. Thank you, Charlie.
Thanks, Sasha. It's about the third or fourth one recently where the LPA have withdrawn their objection during the course of the appeal process, which, depending on which way you look at it, on one level, that's an appeal process working well, issues being resolved. On the other hand, query these cases, applications which should have been granted in the first place. Who knows? But it's an interesting pattern. I think it clearly is a pattern, isn't it? Now, great. Well, thank you for that. Chris, over to you. Girton is where you're going to take us to.
It's in Cambridgeshire. Although, just comment on what Sasha said. I mean, my experience is there's a massive trend of local authorities triggering an appeal and then pulling out, trying to set themselves some costs and giving the residents their day in court. It's an absolutely evident trend of that going on. But you're right, very difficult for the residents to overcome that, but not impossible. That's been done before. So my case is in Cambridgeshire. If we just bring up the case, you can see that it's in Girton, on the edge of Girton village near Cambridge. The appeal was by Castle Hotels against the decision of South Cambridgeshire District Council. As we can see, it was for a care home. Now, the crucial thing is this care home this site is in the green belt. So inevitably, it's all about very special circumstances or whether it's inappropriate development. And the basis of this is that this is an existing hotel. So this isn't a greenfield site. This is a existing hotel. And the issue is actually about whether it's inappropriate development in light of the fact that it was a volume increase. So if we go to the paragraphs that deal with the fundamental issue of how much of an increase it was, we can see that the increase was 53% in terms of the building. And the point was that although it was bigger, actually it was less sprawling, because the existing building was in part 2 or 2.5 stories, but also had a significant 1-story element. And therefore it spread over the site more significantly than the proposed care home that it was to replace. And the inspector thought that was significant. So if we go to the next paragraph, the inspector says, in this case, whilst of significantly greater volume, the new building would be more compact than the existing somewhat rambling structure. And as a consequence of which, he took the view that there would be a net reduction, there'd be a net reduction in parking in hard standing, and overall took the view that it was going to have the same effect in terms of openness. If we go to the next paragraph, he refers to the case law, which we're now becoming familiar with, which is that the concept of openness isn't narrowly focused purely on volume. I remember the case where that's all we used to talk about. Now it's a much broader concept, and so we're looking at preserving openness, concepts of realism and common sense, and the fact that openness is open-textured, and there's a number of factors capable of being relevant, including the visual as well as the physical and spatial. So this debate, where we're looking at a replacement building, isn't just about volume. It's often about looking at a range of different factors, and the obvious one here was we had lots of single-story developments, and it would be replaced by a much more compact form of development, and as a consequence, it wouldn't necessarily have a significant impact on openness. Our greenbelt wasn't the only issue in the case. There was also an issue about a non-designated heritage asset. A lot of people were very fond of the building, but it wasn't actually listed. And the reason it wasn't listed, despite having an interesting history, the local MP lived there and various other factors, the additions, those single-story additions, had significantly diminished the heritage value of the building. And as a consequence, the inspector didn't think it would have any negative impacts on the heritage. It wasn't an asset worth saving in terms of replacing it. We've got some photographs, I think, of the building. There you go. That's the existing building. So looks very attractive, but you can already see to the side the unsympathetic single-story flat roof extension, and there was more of that around the back. And look, it's actually a nice hotel. It's the kind of place that Sasha would stay. Look at that staircase. Go to the next photograph. None of this is relevant to the case, by the way. I'm just showing people what sort of hotel Sasha stays in.
It's a bit down market for Sasha, I think.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, where's the caviar? Yeah, I don't get to stay in places like that. Sasha, I'm usually in the Travel Lodge. So you can see it was a fully functioning hotel replaced by a care home. It was a greater volume, but the inspector took the view that overall it wasn't a significant increase in the harm to openness. So there we go. There's the finished product, and no doubt to become a nice new home for elderly residents.
It's a nice design, that. Thanks, Chris. It's very interesting indeed, a Greenbelt case. Now, we have Paul, so he can't be with us because as chair of the Planning Bar Association, he's currently, right now, chairing an event with the Planning Inspectorate. But he's pre-recorded something earlier, Brit Award style. So I guess you, Rob, to do your magic.
So, yes, thanks, Charlie. Yes, I am. So this is a decision of Madam Inspector Butcher on the 6th of June, 2023, following an inquiry that took place in March in respect of a site at Upperthorpe Road, Westhorpe in Killamarsh, which was an appeal against a decision of North East Derbyshire District Council, who had refused permission for outline consent for up to 397 dwellings to the Howarth Group. The appeal was allowed. It had originally been refused for 7 reasons, but by the time of the appeal, it had been cut down to only one issue, essentially whether the development was inappropriate development in the Greenbelt or not. So it's an interesting question when you drill into it. So it sounds relatively straightforward, but it wasn't. So the majority of the site was allocated in the local plan for development under policy K1, which had an indicative capacity of 330 dwellings. But a little bit of the application site, not the allocation, the application site was located within the adopted Greenbelt. That area would only accommodate surface water attenuation works which essentially required some engineering operations. But all of the homes were outside of the greenbelt. So the inspector concluded that the local authority were wrong, that there wasn't going to be a material change of use to the area within which there was going to be surface water attenuation, just engineering works, and that those works would preserve the openness of the greenbelt and therefore would not be inappropriate development. And there were a number of other third-party issues that were all said to be overcome, but because the inspector concluded that the surface water attenuation works in the greenbelt were not inappropriate development, then the appeal was allowed. It was a relatively courageous appeal, which may not be immediately obvious to everybody. It was courageous because if you are proposing an application and part of your site is in the greenbelt and you are proposing inappropriate development in the greenbelt, then there's clear case law that you should judge the totality of your application, your scheme, as if it was inappropriate development in the greenbelt. Now, this is slightly different because the housing was outside of the greenbelt. The case was a case called Kenmore Manor against the First Secretary of State in 2005, where there was partly a cemetery, partly a crematorium. Cemetery appropriate, crematorium inappropriate development. So the case law is silent on what the position is where you've got development outside the greenbelt, which is inappropriate development in the greenbelt, but you've got a total application. So potentially, had the arguments about material change of use being lost, then this was a case that would have made new law and resolved that question. As it was, the Howarth Group was successful in their appeal. It wasn't inappropriate development in the greenbelt, and they were successful. So, interesting decision. Thank you very much, Charlie.
Thanks, Paul. Another fascinating case. I'm bound to say, had I known that Paul was going to start his pre-record with the words, "Thanks, Charlie, yes, I am," the possibilities would have been endless. Next time, Rob, let me know. Anyway, Mary, over to you to tell us about a case from Rushden.
Thank you very much. And there's definitely a theme to this week's choice of cases, Sasha. This is an appeal by the Co-op and Ilkley Homes against the refusal of Northamptonshire Council to grant planning permission for 133 dwellings and a new pedestrian access off Shirley Road in Rushden. And you can see there the inspector was the very experienced David Wildsmith, and you can see the inquiry sat for 5 days. There were 6 reasons for refusal, but by the time the council lodged their statement of case, 4 of those reasons of refusal had been overcome by additional information that had been submitted with the appeal, and the statutory consultees' responses to that information, in particular the Highway Authority and the Lead Flood Authority, indicating, as it were, their satisfaction with highway and drainage issues. The council were left, therefore, with 2 reasons for refusal, but they concluded that was not sufficient to maintain an objection to the appeal, and so they chose not to resist the appeal, and they called no evidence. In this particular case, 2 town councils continued to object and appeared at the inquiry, and one of those town councils called a professional town planner, and the local MP, one Peter Bone, also appeared at the inquiry, along with various local councillors and residents. And I noticed that one of the local councillors also had the surname Bone, and deduced that might have been Peter's wife. So, again, another tale of submitting an appeal with additional information, but at least the council in this case made their decision early on, and that would have been signalled and telegraphed through the statement of case. These things cause much more upset when residents only discover this on the day of the inquiry. So the original access proposal had led to, or would have led to, the loss of 6 trees, but altered arrangements meant that only 1 tree would definitely be lost, and there was a loss of a possible second tree. Now, the crucial thing about this site was that the majority of it was a greenfield site, but the majority of it was allocated in the neighbourhood plan for a minimum of 150 dwellings. Let me remind you, this was an application for 133 in that context. And the inspector noted that it was a site in flood zone 1, not subject to any environmental or landscape protection. The council here had a 7.5-year housing land supply. The inspector was quite clear that the most important policies for determining this appeal showed a high consistency with the MPPF, so there was no question here of a tilted balance. But despite the fact that it was an allocated site in the neighbourhood plan, the locals continued to object to the proposal, and they complained that the access had been changed. And they suggested that when they had voted in the neighbourhood plan, they hadn't voted for the access that was the subject of the appeal. So the inspector looked at that, but he said the policy in the neighbourhood plan simply referred to an appropriate vehicular access without stipulating which road that access should be taken off. So he concluded that the construction of 133 dwellings with the accesses in front of him was fundamentally acceptable in principle. And he looked at whether 133 versus 150 rendered it unacceptable. No, there were good reasons for those differences. He concluded that the removal of the 2 trees wouldn't have an unacceptable impact on the street scene. The locals continued to maintain highway-type objections, but they had no technical highways evidence. The inspector was conscious that the Highway Authority had removed their objection. The appellant called some technical highway evidence, and unsurprisingly, the locals were not able to overcome that technical evidence without any of their own. So they were unsuccessful on their highway objections. Worth saying that one of their objections was that they wanted a level crossing, and there wasn't a level crossing. As far as I could see, the policy didn't stipulate that there needed to be a level crossing, and it wasn't necessary in the context of there being an alternative. So said one Mr. Young KC, who was acting for the appellant on this occasion. The locals were concerned about the construction and the delivery of the modular units. So here's a developer coming along, saving, you might think, on noise by doing things off-site and just assembling on-site. But that attracted a complaint about the construction impacts from vehicles. And again, the inspector found that that wasn't unacceptable. Allegations about a cramped layout, a lower quantum of space than was specified in the policy, didn't find ultimate favour with the inspector. Another curious one was the accommodation was for older people, and it was in the form of maisonettes. And that seemed to have attracted quite a lot of objection, both originally from the council and the locals. But again, looked at objectively, the maisonettes met all the right standards, and the inspector thought that the accommodation would be perfectly satisfactory. So for all those reasons, whilst the locals maintained and the town councils all of their objections, the appeal was allowed. Congratulations to Chris and his team.
I just say, Charlie, as many people are observing, Ilka Homes have filed a notice of going into administration. There's 1,000 people working in their factory up at Flaxby. All the team that I work with, they'll be very, very worried about their jobs at the moment, but they are looking for a purchaser. They're looking for a purchaser for that factory, and let's hope they find one.
Thanks, Chris. Great. Well, now on to our discussion with Sue. So Sue, welcome again. Thank you for joining us. Start by asking you to tell our viewers, some of whom will know all about the Wildlife Trust, some of whom may know very little, if anything. Tell us a little about the Wildlife Trust movement and about your role within it as the land use planning lead.
Well, thank you very much for having me today. So the Wildlife Trusts are a set of charities. We're sort of a federation made up of 46 individual wildlife trusts, with the Royal Society of Wildlife Trusts at the sort of forming a central hub. And we are a membership charity. We have 900,000 members across the country, and we cover the whole of the UK. Our aim is to restore nature on land and at sea, on our own nature reserves, and working with lots of other partners. So every individual wildlife trust will work locally with businesses, local authorities, local communities to help nature recover for the future. And then the central hub provides a means of communication, joining us all up. And in the case of my work, helps us to provide a single voice to government for advocacy. So my role is to take a strategic lead on planning the way we work in England. So obviously, because planning is devolved, then I work with the English trusts. So I can't really say much about the rest of the UK. But obviously, sort of thing, we do speak to each other. And I work on our policies around housing, infrastructure, protected areas, and then work to influence national planning policy and legislation.
Thank you. Might come back to the relationship with the parts of the UK a little bit later, but within England, which is your sort of your personal remit, what do you think are the most pressing issues for the relationship between land use planning and ecology at the moment?
So for us, we're really concerned that nature is in crisis at the moment. We've seen massive declines. There's a nature crisis, there's a climate emergency. The two are really connected, and we can't solve the climate emergency without having better nature, because nature is, this enormous carbon sink. Think about trees, but there are other habitats as well that are really important for, soaking up carbon. And helping us adapt to climate change in the future. So it underpins a lot of other things in society. If we don't have healthy soils and pollinators, we won't do very well with farming. So we need to bring nature back across 30% at least of land and sea, so that it can recover and work properly. And the government has also signed up to an international treaty to protect 30% of land in the UK by the year 2030. So that's going to be a big challenge, because that's not the only target that government's working to. It's got housing targets, it's got net zero targets, it's got food targets. All of this will take up land, and we have less land than is needed to deliver all of those targets unless we really think strategically about how we use our land in this country. So we think that we need a national land use framework, which would be fundamentally a spatial policy, a spatial map for how we decide on land use, what we prioritise where, what can work together, what needs to have its own area of land. And for us, nature sits at the heart of that, because of its fundamental underpinning of so many other things in society. And often you can decide where you put housing, where you put a road, but you can't decide where nature goes, because it's built around what's already there, and we've got very little of our nature left. So we would like to see a spatial plan for nature, with forming a central part of the land use framework nationally.
How would the National Land Use Spatial Framework work? Is it something that DEFRA would produce, or DLUC? And would it be within the current planning system, or is it a sort of form of zoning? Can you tell us a bit more about how it works?
So DEFRA have already committed to producing a land use framework, and they are talking to DLUC, I know, and we've really pushed for it to contain more than just the DEFRA area of work. So not just nature, food and farming, climate, but also the economic infrastructure as well, the economic land uses. So clearly DLUC will have an interest in that, and energy infrastructure as well. So it will go further. It should be cross-departmental, but then it should form a sort of strategic prioritisation framework that will then allow the other land uses to be to be allocated, but then it should also inform a local level of decision making.
Thank you. And just building on that, I was fascinated to see a recent edition of Property Week quoting you as saying, and I quote, "There doesn't need to be a conflict between nature and housing," which is really interesting because often a lot of the time people perceive it is a question of in any particular area, one or the other. So within the context of the framework you've described, how do you see the solutions to the nature crisis on the one hand and the solutions to the housing crisis are dovetailing each other? How does that work in practice? How do you get both?
Well, I mean, obviously we need land for housing and land for nature. So we need to kind of think quite carefully about housing, but we absolutely think that the housing crisis needs to be resolved. People need housing, they need affordable housing, they need good quality housing, and we're totally behind that. So we've worked with partners like Shelter to understand the economics behind this and make sure that we form our own policies and principles around a greater understanding of society's needs in terms of housing. So we have put a set of principles together. I don't think I've got time to go into the detail too much here, but this is on our website. But basically, it's about building the right houses in the first place to address local need. So that needs to be assessed locally. National targets are useful, but I think local targets are better. And then you need to have the right types of houses, the right tenures, and social housing is a really important part of the mix because affordable housing is often social housing. What we don't want to see is government meeting its targets for 300,000 houses a year and yet still having a crisis at the end of that, and having damaged nature in the first place. So things have got to change. We think that sort of building in the right place is a fundamental part of this. So avoiding damaging nature in the first place, avoiding the important sites for nature, the designated sites, or sites that have priority habitat, irreplaceable habitat, avoiding floodplain building, constructing buildings that will be compatible with really high standards to think about not having an impact on climate change in the future. And then building with nature in mind, putting in features for nature into new development, putting accessible green space into new development, and then delivering biodiversity net gain on top of that so that all development contributes to nature's recovery.
Thank you. And on the subject of net gain, do you consider that it's work, appreciating that the statutory regime hasn't yet come into force, but the shadow regime that we're all operating to the moment, is it working? And what, if any, improvements would you make to the net gain regime as it currently stands beyond what you've already described?
Well, I think it's early days to say whether it's working or not. The schemes that are coming online at the moment have been, within the sort of voluntary framework. And so, we look forward to seeing what it's like when there's the level playing field with everybody doing this. We really believe it's a good in principle, a good thing. Nature's declining, as I've said. Everybody needs to play their part in its recovery, and this is a really good way for the development industry to make a difference and to lessen their impacts on nature. So if it's done well, it's a really positive step, but there is that caveat about doing it well. So the things that we really think need to happen is it absolutely has to be based on the mitigation hierarchy. We need development applications to have gone through that process of, demonstrably avoiding harm in the first place, then mitigating any impact on nature that hasn't been able to be avoided, and compensating what can't be mitigated, and only then can biodiversity net gain come into play. So the mitigation hierarchy is key to this, and we are seeing some developments in the voluntary schemes seeing biodiversity net gain as a way of hopping over the mitigation hierarchy. And we don't think that that's going to work then as a scheme for nature's recovery. We're also really pleased to see the mandatory requirement for 10%, but this is a bare minimum, really. Nature is quite hard to recreate, and so you need some contingency, and that 10% could simply be the contingency in some places to make sure that development doesn't create a net loss. So we would really push for a greater proportion of net gain. We want to see the metric applied properly. Again, it's early days. That's going to take some working out, I think. And monitoring and enforcement are key. And I think enforcement is an issue in the planning sector. It's a resource issue. If this isn't enforced, it's just not going to work, and it is going to lead to greater biodiversity loss. So, there's a few caveats around our support for biodiversity net gain.
Interesting to hear your thoughts this time next year if it's up and running and see how it's actually the statutory regime is working. Now, changing the subject slightly, for various reasons, it tends to be housing developments that catch the headlines when it comes to planning-related news stories. But a strong case could be made that the land use with by far the biggest impact on ecology is not housing, not even infrastructure or commercial, but farming. It's intensive agriculture that tends to involve obliterating local wildlife through fertilizers, etc. Livestock farming, cows, one of the biggest contributions to greenhouse gas and climate change, methane. You've got the farming lobby responsible for the badger cull, the uncontrolled use of fertilizers being the single biggest cause of the phosphate crisis, harming affected water courses and causing homes to be held up. And the solution seems to be pay the farmers so they can plant some trees or create some wetlands. So in light of all of that, I'm interested to know what work are the Wildlife Trust doing in the space of farming and helping farming raise its game? And do you think, as a planner working in this field, that there should be greater planning regulation of farming to make sure that the wrongs of the past aren't repeated by that industry?
Well, funnily enough, I've spent yesterday out on site with some farmers who are doing some great stuff for nature, actually. So, the Wildlife Trust work with farmers right across the country, in fact, across all the countries. And we're also farmers ourselves. We have a number of working farms. So, we understand the issues, and we know a lot of good farmers who are doing great things. As you say, 70% of England is farmed, and so there's the opportunity either for a high impact, but also an opportunity for a lot of improvement around nature conservation. And so we strongly support sustainable farming, and that has been, I think, impacted by government policy over the years. And so the important thing is to have policies in place that support farmers to farm sustainably. So we've got the Agriculture Act, which was implemented in 2020, and from that are coming new environmental grant schemes for farmers. One of the big wins from the Environment Act was this principle of public money for public goods. So, grants to farmers should deliver something that benefits society. It's taxpayers' money. We should be seeing things like flood prevention or, nature enhancement for the taxpayers' money. And that was enshrined in the Agriculture Act. We're a little concerned that it is slipping on the government's agenda, so we're working very hard to lobby to make sure that farmers are supported to do the right thing.
Thanks, Sue. And lastly, before I know to others, somebody, Richard's asked a question in the chat, and there's lots of really interesting questions. Please do keep them coming. A question that we did touch upon the other day when we all first met, which was people who deliberately degenerate a site to create a lower baseline. Now, I think there's something in the matrix, isn't there, that in net gain terms, you ignore deliberate degeneration. But do you think there's any more tightening up to avoid, for example, on a site which has trees that are important but not TPO trees? It may be possible in some situations for people to undertake works to those trees legally. The other things that can be done to habitats where it's not a criminal offence to interfere with them, but in principle, developers could interfere with them in order to create a lower baseline. Is that a real risk in your judgment? Is there more that can be done to avoid deliberate games being played, gamesmanship, which harms the ecology?
It's an excellent question, and sadly, it does happen. We do see examples of trees being cut down, or long-term meadows being ploughed up, so that there is much less biodiversity by the time a planning application comes forward. And one of the solutions to that is that in the biodiversity net gain matrix, if it's shown that that has happened, then the developer has to actually work from the previous high value of the site and not the damaged site. And beyond that, I can't really say what kind of sanctions ought to be imposed, but you would hope that they would influence the decision making around the development, because we'd like to see ideally those sites restored, not built on.
Because in the context of heritage, there's a provision, isn't there, that says sort of deliberate neglect isn't taken into account in understanding the heritage baseline. One does wonder whether there might be some sense in having an equivalent in the ecology. Anyway, enough from me. I think we're going to Paul first, given he's pre-recorded. I'm tempted to ask Paul a silly question. I hope he might say yes, Charlie, but I'll refrain, because what I would ask probably be far too rude to broadcast this time of day. So, Paul, over to you.
Hi, sorry I can't be there. My question is, the planning system operates on the basis of what a developer is required to secure if permission is granted. Given how long it takes to secure permission, is there merit in having a system which would enable a landowner or developer to be able to secure credit for ecological benefits which they undertake prior to the grant of permission, but which are referable to securing that consent, say after an application is submitted?
Well, I think it's definitely there's merit in that, because damaged habitats or lost habitats take time to recreate. So we do sort of promote the idea of create the habitats first before you harm them. And certainly in terms of biodiversity net gain, that is something that is being looked at. So markets are being developed for biodiversity net gain, where delivery bodies such as the Wildlife Trust, but plenty of others, might buy land that's low in biodiversity value and carry out specific habitat creation that then is recouped through selling on biodiversity net gain units. So I think that's a useful way to proceed. But with the caveat that things need to be very transparent, so that from our point of view, we want to know that any units we sell are being used to deliver net gain or compensation, if it's part of the compensation package, on a scheme that is has gone through the proper processes of mitigation and so on. But it also needs to be transparent the other way, so that developers know that there's no double accounting and that they're not paying for something that should have been paid for elsewhere.
Great question. Great answer. Sasha, you're next.
Thank you, Charlie. So my question's about the utilisation mitigation land. I mean, our current system is underpinned by a belief that if you're proposing to change land that's currently underdeveloped or whatever it may be, housing, etc., that it is appropriate to have mitigation land, whether it be SANG or nitrate neutrality. I mean, do you know whether there's been any studies which actually shows that such a kind of tactic strategy actually works, that by bringing forward such land, it does protect those interests which you're seeking to protect by diverting usage elsewhere, for example, in SAGs?
Well, I'm not aware of any actual research on this, and I think that's partly because these are fairly new schemes. And so for example, with the SANGs, the alternative access provision, then that's to avoid damage to special protection areas, they have a regular monitoring cycle, but it's something like every 7 years. So it would show up in the next set of monitoring whether it's been effective, and that despite the amount of housing, say, around the Thames Basin heaths, the ground nesting birds haven't been trampled underfoot, and the populations of birds are succeeding. So it's partly reliant on the government monitoring of these schemes. In the case of something like nutrient neutrality, then we do know that taking nutrients out of the system is going to reduce the amount of nutrients going into special protection areas. So that's an easier calculation to make up front that will definitely work.
Thank you, Charlie.
Thank you both. Mary?
Thank you, Charlie. Sue, my question is this. What are the ingredients for successful local nature recovery strategies? And I just want to also pick up this point, which Claire Tester has raised. Would one of those ingredients be allocations in the local plan? In other words, should they be allocated should these nature recovery strategy areas be identified and then allocated in local plans? So what do you think are the key successful ingredients?
So I think, local nature recovery strategies have a written element identifying the sort of priorities of what needs to be done for nature locally for its recovery, but also a mapping element. And to me, that's quite key. That there should be a map that shows what you've got already, and then what space you need for nature in order to help it recover in future. So I do think that having that in the local plan would be useful, because it would allow other development to work around it and avoid current and future conflict. But I also think local nature recovery strategies are the place for the mechanism for integrating policy, so that policy across government can, when it has that spatial element, the discussions can be had locally where the knowledge is, so that you can look at where you might improve nature and where it would give you other benefits. Using flooding maps to show where you could implement natural solutions to flooding, using health deprivation mapping to show where you need more access for nature, or perhaps where you need tree planting to improve air quality. All of those things that nature can play a part in. If you have local expertise around the table to discuss in the preparation of nature recovery strategies, then you can get a lot better for your investment in nature enhancement.
Yeah, I agree with you, and thank you very much for that answer. And I think that actually the word strategy suggests to me that it isn't one solution. It isn't a matter of sort of allocating land. It's a matter of doing a combination of things, and your strategy might be in part identifying land. It might also be, for example, ensuring that whenever an application comes forward, there is some connection between that application and the recovery of nature, whether it's on-site or if it's in an urban area, it might be off-site. So it's going to be a combination of these things, and it certainly does seem to make sense to join everything together. And I know government's quite keen on the whole idea of digital planning, which is really what you're talking about in terms of mapping.
Yes, I think it's going to be essential to have digital information on the environment. It's a bit patchy at the moment, so that's got to be improved. But then I think local nature recovery strategies will provide information about the opportunities. They don't necessarily have to be prescriptive in some cases. No, you don't have to say nature has to be enhanced here rather than there.
Yeah.
But, this is where the opportunity is to do several things. And so, I think they could then really improve local delivery.
Can I ask a follow-up to that, or Paddy to Chris, which is, there have been a couple of greenbelt decisions over the last few years where one of the factors has been a new country park put forward. as part of very special circumstances. Occurs to me, is the scope in some places for developers to create a new local nature reserve, which could be designated? I mean, how easy is it to create a new, from a not such a good baseline, a new nature reserve which could be designated locally, could be a local wildlife site, S10 or whatever, enabled through development? Is that a runner at all in some places, in some cases, or not?
Well, I hope so, because we're going to be doing a lot of habitat creation over the next few years, part of biodiversity net gains, part of our aim for having 30% of land for nature by 2030. So, habitat creation is a really vital element of this. What worries me a bit is that it will take time to make it as good as a local wildlife site or a triple SI. And so, therefore, what do you do in the interim when you're spending money on this site, you're spending time and effort on this site, but it's not protected, it's not designated in any way. So, we have proposed that there should be a new designation for land that is in nature recovery that would provide that security for the future.
So this would be effectively off-site net gain contributions deployed on a new site, which would then have to be sort of protected from other undermines.
Yes. Yeah, but I see no reason why you couldn't have, rather like currently, you have statutory designations, you have non-statutory designations. So, for example, take a local wildlife site. They are non-statutory and they are on most policies and proposals maps. And you could extend that to nature recovery areas, which might not be quite up to the standard of your local wildlife site, but are on the way. And by the way, I also think this is a great opportunity to improve all those early SANGs. One of our comments, Chris is making comments about how poor, frankly, the early SANGs were. But again, this is an opportunity, is it not, to improve the early SANGs, either from off-site biodiversity net gain or indeed just nature recovery. It's all good.
Very interesting. Now, Chris, your question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Charlie. Hi, Stu. Just on Charlie's point, I mean, the NPPF explicitly suggests actually that for Greenbelt, it's access to land and ecological enhancement, which might be seen as the compensation for releasing a Greenbelt site. I certainly think that is something that comes with Greenbelt sites. And thank you, Sue, for recognising the housing crisis as well, and to realise that you don't need to just focus on one crisis. You need to focus on them both. I have got a question, which is a very simple question, which is, which of our wildlife right now is most under threat? I've got a follow-up question from Kevin Scott. We've had some fantastic questions from the audience. But that first one, quickly, if I may, which bit of our wildlife is most under threat?
That's not such a simple question, actually. And maybe coming from the Wildlife Trust, I would say all of it, because it's really interconnected. We learned at school about food webs, but everything has a knock-on effect. If you lose one thing, you lose something else. And if you think about insect loss, well, insects are sort of quite near the bottom of the food chain. A lot of things eat them. If you're losing insects, then you are losing the food that birds feed to their chicks. So you're going to lose, have diminished bird populations. So everything's interconnected. The bottom of that food web is really, really important, but so's the top. So if we had more pine martens, we'd have more red squirrels. So the whole thing really, I think, is important. But from the planning perspective, for me, I think we need to make more space for nature. And then nature is actually quite good at rebounding and coming back. So, we've lost so much nature already. We want to look after what we've got and make more space so that nature can then help to sort of recover itself, really.
Okay. Well, Kevin Scott's question is, do you see a role for the Wildlife Trust to play in delivering suitable projects for BNG compensation? Should the Wildlife Trust be, at the forefront of this?
I think we do see a role for ourselves, and we would like to be the sort of green delivery partners. We would like to be making the best offer and showing how biodiversity net gain can really work to contribute to nature's recovery if it's done properly and to a high standard. So we're very keen to get involved and set a high bar.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. Some really interesting food for thought there. And I think a gauntlet appropriately laid down both to ecologists and developers, which is why we wanted you on the show. So thank you very much indeed. Very interesting, I say, to see what your thoughts are this time next year, actually, when some of the policy work that we've been discussing has started to roll out. Now, next week, it's our last episode of this. So it's not next week, forgive me, next episode. Which I think may be in 3 weeks today, because Paul's going to be away in 2 weeks today in a place that doesn't have a connection. We'll confirm the date. We believe we've got the Attorney General, Victoria Prentice, former DEFRA Minister, farmer herself. I say we believe because Paul and I were out whiskey tasting with her last night, and after 3 whiskies, she agreed to come on the show. I have got a text message, which the others have seen, confirming whether she remembers agreeing to come on the show today is a moot point, but we believe she's going to come on. She's a wonderful person, a brilliant lawyer, and somebody who once participated in a planning inquiry on behalf of her constituents and beat Paul on an onshore wind turbine inquiry as well, and that's no mean feat, as we all know. So we very much hope to have His Majesty's Attorney General Victoria Prentice, KCMP, on what I believe is the 11th of July, unless I'm corrected. As I say, we'll confirm the dates and the identity in due course. In the meantime, all it's left for me to say is thank you once again, Sue. Thank you, dear viewers, for watching. And see, I think, at least 3 of you in about 15 minutes' time in person. Cheerio.